That's right. Mercedes held out her hand. Do you want to come over and say hello? Hith stared at them for several seconds. The more rules I eat for breakfast, the less time I have to shave, he said finally, and exited the room, heading towards the back of the house. Mercedes looked delightedly flabbergasted. I've never heard him say that before. I've got to write that down, Pleat said as he opened his notebook. Chapter 6. The Bottom of a Tupperware Lid. Wapshock Falls is a collection of 1- and 2-story houses mostly invisible from the air due to the tall trees that surround everything. Only the town square where Wapshock Falls' only church raises its spire above the trees, along with the Monkit family's department store, would grant an observer in, say, a hot air balloon, evidence that an ordered civic community was down there. Nancy Burke did not return to her hometown in a hot air balloon, but the convertible German car her parents had bought for her when she started college. I'm back for the inauguration of the Frolicsome Caravan, she explained to a couple of old people who stopped her in front of the disused building that had once been Niobe's furniture store to talk. Why would you come all the way back here for that? Mrs. Krause, one of the old people, asked her, but got no answer she found satisfactory, only that Nancy had always enjoyed the inauguration of the Frolicsome Caravan. Why would she come all the way back here for that? Repeated the old lady as she and her companions continued their trip to the conditorei at the edge of the square. It's not like it's a tradition or anything. They only started it about 25 years ago. It's a tradition to her, Mrs. Asia tried to explain. Nancy had been told by her parents that her brother was practicing with his band at Jason Slayman's house. That was where she was going. It lay on the other side of the square, the so-called swamp side, from her family's. What do they call the side of town where the Burkes live? I asked Jerry as we approached Wapshock Falls in our hot air balloon. Jerry thumbed through an amateurishly printed guidebook while making an sound. It's called the Arbor side, he finally said, even though they're both covered with trees. Yeah, I guess so. Nancy's brother's band, she discovered on entering the Slayman's basement and looking at the crude, hand-painted lettering on the bass drum, was Hopper Vomit. She politely waited until her brother and his 2 friends had finished playing. Apparently the song was called Your Missionary Work is Obsolete, to judge by the repeated refrain, before asking, I thought you guys were called Beast Battalion. We were, Chris Burke replied. He took his bass guitar from around his neck, for he knew a hug was coming and unavoidable, and put it on its stand. But we changed it. Craig Lingham, the guitarist, examined his bandmate's sister's lean but satisfactorily feminine form as he thought of the gentle ribbing they had taken from their contemporaries over the Beast Battalion name. Had they caved to public pressure? Well, never again. Do we get hugs? Jason Slayman, the drummer, asked. Oh, sure, Nancy agreed after she had released her brother. She wrapped her arms around herself and said, Hug, hug. Craig thought it was pretty lame, but something about the sarcastic look on the girl's face made him snigger in response. Jason, who was a tubby youngster with short, spiky hair, pushed the joke, such as it was, further. I'm serious. I want my hug, goddammit. Nancy ignored him. How much longer are you going to be? She addressed herself solely to Chris. I don't know, a couple more hours. A couple more hours? Yeah. Chris looked at Craig. We're professionals now, he said half mockingly, half proudly, as if trying out the pride, the stance. Just because, Nancy stopped herself, they had sounded fairly tight when she'd walked in, even if the music was garbage, some offshoot of heavy metal, boy music. Look, I just wanted to know if you're going to eat dinner with us. Chris sighed. Okay. He picked up his bass. We're getting paid, Craig told Nancy in his cool, sneering tone as she began to back away. You want to hear our big hit? Chris asked. Nancy smiled with her teeth hidden. She could see herself being forced to endure song after horrible song. No thanks, she shook her head. I gotta go. Chris shouted 1, 2, 3, 4, but there must have been some confusion as to what song the phrase big hit referred to, for 2, perhaps 3 different songs emerged from the ensemble, followed closely by an argument that Nancy could hear upstairs as she took her leave of Mrs. Slayman. The latter woman was the rare parent who not only encouraged her child's involvement with rock and roll, but also tolerated, even seemed to enjoy the company of her child's friends. Slammer's coming along, isn't he? Mrs. Slayman asked Nancy. Slammer? Chris, explained Mrs. Slayman. Slammer's his nickname. I should say his band name. You didn't know? No, Nancy had not known. She headed back towards the town square with the thought uppermost in her mind that her brother was changing. Just below that thought, supporting it one might say, was the one that said she didn't like it. "I heard you did a photo shoot for Beleaguered." Mrs. Mulligan, accompanied by her daughter Callie, stopped Nancy on the street to see how college had affected a Wapshock Falls girl. Callie, like several other seniors at the high school, was highly influenced by girls like Nancy, although the full extent of this influence wasn't known. For instance, Callie not only wanted to go to the University of Tiny Denver, but also wanted a German convertible and to pledge to a sorority. It was suspected enough to make any local mother curious, if not concerned. "Yes," Nancy answered and launched at Mrs. Mulligan's urging into a truncated but nonetheless exciting description of the event, while Callie stood there drinking it all in and fantasizing about faceless sexual encounters and drug abuse. Jerry and I appeared over Wapshock Falls in our balloon. I had named the balloon Future 1996, and, in keeping with that idea, had it illustrated with a picture of myself dressed in the uniform of a convenience store clerk. "Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it?" I asked Jerry as the basket in which we stood grazed the cross-top steeple of the church. "No," Jerry agreed. "It should have been a picture of you as a successful saxophonist." "Yeah." I leaned over the edge of the basket and looked down at the people pointing up at us, avoiding the question of what a successful saxophonist would look like. Much like an unsuccessful one, I should imagine, now that I have the leisure to contemplate the issue. I wasn't thinking about how it would appear to these good, simple people. The good, simple people, some of them distressed at the abuse of the sacred symbol rising above the treetops, gathered around our balloon as it landed in the middle of the local high school's football field. "I don't think we bent it," I said as I climbed out, not caring really if we had. Piss on Christ. "I'm Gordon Wheelworm, mayor of Wapshock Falls." A short man in a cotton ball beard stepped forward and held out his hand. Jerry later commented that he wasn't all that short, but from my lordly vantage he did seem short, especially with his little glasses, balding crown, and thin glued-on-looking beard. He had on a short-sleeved plaid shirt tucked into pleated khakis securely belted about his paunchy middle. "I'm Toadskabode, and this is Jerry Lancaster. Welcome to Wapshock Falls and the inauguration of the frolicsome caravan," Wheelworm said a little louder, a little more formally. He held out his hand, which I shook. The crowd around us applauded as I announced the commencement of festivities. The handshake was repeated for the benefit of the newspaper's photographer, who got there late. The collapsing of the balloon took half an hour. The townspeople helped. We packed everything in the back of someone's pickup and were driven to our accommodations, the finest bed and breakfast in town, the Instrumental Inn. Once there, I began to hunt through the books on display to see if there was anything worth stealing. In my room there were a number of volumes, but these would be immediately missed and the blame for their absence correctly assigned. It was in the bookshelves to either side of the fireplace in the inn's great room that I found what I was looking for. Of course, I didn't take them right away. That would have to wait until our last day, but I did mark their titles and locations carefully. "Confusion in the Igloo as the DVD is refused," "Europe's Last Obstacle to Federalism," "Baby Roach Hitched a Ride," "The Inhuman Daiquiri," and several others. "The inauguration dinner is at 8 o'clock, Mayor Wheelworm had told us. It's at the old depot. I'll pick you up at 7:30, all right?" Indeed, it was all right, I let him know. That gave me over 3 hours in which to sneak through the entrance to the tunnel system hidden in my room beneath the bed and make my way to the Burke's house. I had to know if Nancy was actually a talking ape cleverly disguised. While I was gone, I left Jerry in his room, lying on the bed, snacking on a tube of ethereal paste and thumbing through the latest issue of Wapshock Falls magazine. The picture on the cover was of a man with a great bath rug of a beard, wearing a leather apron over his LL Bean-type clothing, leaning on a well-worn wooden apparatus that, according to the accompanying blurb, enabled Dan Houses to make buttons from old crackers. On page 47, however, was an article entitled, "The Electric Operative Battles His Digital Destiny." Jerry read this raptly, as there was a drawing of an antique mule-powered ice cream maker on the same page. King Coob, so began the article, ran his hands along the old belt. "It took 25 deer hides to make this belt," he informed his assistant Clouto. "I know, I read in the original literature that came with the machine." Clouto whistled in appreciation. 25, he repeated. "What about that?" "Of course, today a synthetic material could be substituted." King Coob sounded as if he could equally be talking to himself. It was evident that he knew the limitations of both Clouto's intellect and his interest in the workings of the old machine. I don't know if I'll do that, though, the king continued. I mean, we're going to have an actual mule running the thing. We might as well have authentic deer-hide belts turning the wheels. He looked at Clouto as if on the verge of asking, "What do you think?" but only paused, mouth slightly agape, eyes peering into a future of revenues and fun that was symbolized in his mind by images of children wearing T-shirts with Leonard Nimoy on them and eating ice cream from cones shaped like cones. King Coop mumbled, his eyes moving between Clouto's ridiculous footwear like one of those kinetic desk toys with the silver balls. "What?" Clouto asked. "Cones!" Coop repeated excitedly. He glanced at Clouto's face, then went to the window of the half-built ice cream parlor in which the antique machine had been set up. He looked out on the partially landscaped street of the Leonard Nimoy Memorial's new Heartland Exposition section. He watched a couple of workmen who were supposed to be laying reproduction cobblestones down, leaning on a wheelbarrow and talking, yet he did not dash to the door and yell at them to get back to work. His mind was awhirl with questions about cones for the ice cream. Should they be traditional cones? If so, how traditional should they be? Or should they be futuristic somehow? Perhaps shaped like phasers or tricorders. It was this fantasy that at first arrested his thoughts on the subject. Was there something in Star Trek lore that was vaguely cone-shaped? Something of a roughly ice cream holding shape? Maybe in keeping with the whole turn-of-the-century theme, they should serve the ice cream in bowls. "Nah, we'd have to wash them," he muttered to himself. "What's that?" Clouto asked. As usual, he was dressed in his chauffeur's uniform, black boots, black slacks, black blazer with 2 rows of buttons down the front like a John Wayne shirt gone satanic, and a black peaked cap with a shiny visor. This last he turned in his gloved hands nervously. Whenever the boss got like this, it meant more work for somebody. He just hoped it wasn't him. King Coop sighed. "I forgot to make provisions for how to serve the ice cream," he confessed. "Well, cones is usually how I eat it," Clouto remarked. Coop glared at Clouto. If the boy wasn't his sister's son, he would have been fired long ago. Luckily, he had no idea that King Coop was his uncle. For those of you wondering what a replica of the typical Midwestern American small town from approximately 1899 was doing being erected in the middle of the Leonard Nimoy Memorial, you need look no further than King Coop's greedy mind. He had made the tenuous link between such a construction and Nimoy's appearance in the film version of the musical Pigeonfoot's Bridge Mix. True, Nimoy had not spoken in the film, being only a bit-part actor at the time, but one could clearly see him on the train at the very beginning, portraying one of the traveling salesmen watching Professor Hall demonstrate his patented combination suffragette and temperance advocate silencing machine. "Or out of a bowl," Clouto added, not knowing exactly what he had said wrong. Directly across the street from the ice cream parlor was the barber shop. Sitting in the single chair was Dirk Ramble. Looking out of the window he saw, not idle workmen, or a street of half-laid cobblestones, but Nancy Burke walking by in her matching cardigan and skirt. "Excuse me," he told Sammy, the aged haircut man, as he rose from the chair. "Now what the hell?" Sammy expostulated. Dirk went to the door and looked down the sidewalk at Nancy's wool-clad behind. Now, before it was too late, he called to her. "Nancy!" She turned. Dirk, the barber sheet around his neck, waved at her furiously. He beckoned to her to come back. "Nancy, come here," he shouted. Once he saw her headed back his way, Dirk resumed his seat. "Don't do that again," Sammy warned, "or you'll lose part of an ear." He snapped his scissors in front of Dirk's face. "Which one? It's up to me." "Just cut my hair, old man," Dirk growled. Nancy entered the barber shop. It wasn't her first time. She had set foot in the place once before as a child, asking to put up a handbill for a missing dog. Sammy, looking no younger then, had told her no. Dirk appraised her with a crooked grin. To think he had let this slip out of town without delving any deeper into its mysteries. He had expected Nancy to say hello, or at least demand to know what had happened, what he wanted. But she only stood there, glancing at the sports memorabilia and clippings of right-wing editorials that covered the walls. Finally, Dirk said something. "You back for the inauguration?" His contemptuous emphasis was only slight. "Yep," Nancy nodded. Her arms were folded, obscuring Dirk's view of her chest. "I bet your parents are glad to see you," Sammy suggested with a smile. He looked at her from under brows that threatened to crush the cliffside dwellings below. "Yeah," Nancy gave the old man a return smile, but only one born of baseline good manners. Dirk felt he must make some effort here before she insisted on going home for supper or some such shit. "So, how's university life?" "It's fine." She dreaded having to give the details of the photo shoot all over again, but apparently Dirk hadn't heard about it. Tiny Denver's a big party town. This was a commonplace, one that everyone made when talking of the town, especially people who lived there. Yeah, well, I'm usually too busy to party. Nancy finally looked into Dirk's eyes for more than just a glance. She seemed to be asking, haven't you exhausted your subject matter yet? Really? Dirk sounded as if he couldn't believe it. If he had his way, he'd be in the thick of alcohol and sex every night. Yep, well, that's the way it is. College is a lot of studying. Shit, I got enough of that in high school. Sammy firmly pushed Dirk's head down and forward. He began work on his neck. Yeah, Nancy said, I'll bet you did. Well, I gotta go. Hey, maybe I'll see you around during the inauguration, Dirk called out with his chin pressed against his chest. He saw Nancy's feet leave the shop. Son, that girl's got no interest in you. Sammy allowed Dirk to raise his head slightly. Dirk said nothing. He knew the old man was right. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could go to college. Of course, he had no intention to get a degree or learn anything, but the quality of girls had to be had better than in this dump. Hell, why go to college for that? Why not just go to California? Hang out and see what happens. Something was bound to come his way if he just made himself available. Let me tell you a story, Sammy ordered the young man. There was a man named Pleat Mathras. He lived in a small college town, although he hadn't actually gone to school there. He had been a journalism major at a major university and come to this small town called Tiny Denver to be the editor of the local arts newspaper called The Umbrella. Pleat had begun to feel that he had made a big mistake in moving to Tiny Denver. He felt that he was stuck, that he was going nowhere. The Umbrella had become nothing more than a collection of ads for bars, interspersed with announcements for crafts fairs. He decided that he had to do something. To that end, he started writing a book. He told everybody the book was going to be about a local legend named Homegrown Malone, supposedly a half-man, half-monster that grew the finest marijuana in the area out in the swamp. But in actuality, Pleat's book was about the people he knew, the people he had met while living in Tiny Denver. Since the town was somewhat famous for being the birthing ground for two of the biggest bands in the world at the time, Kerouac's Liver and Nostril Mate, he figured the book would be a surefire bestseller. Surefire. That's a funny word when you think about it, isn't it? Anyway, Pleat met this girl named Angelica that he really liked a lot. She was at least 10 years younger than he, but seemed to get along with him pretty good. In fact, Pleat liked her so well that he took her to meet his friends Bach and Mercedes at their isolated house outside town. They were going to stay the weekend. The only thing Pleat was worried about was Angelica's reaction to his friend's talking dog. Talking dog! Dirk Ramble, his precious hair finalized, his neck shaved and powdered, stood up and got out his wallet. He had been working at the Honda dealership since he was 16 and, unless he instigated a rather uncharacteristic upheaval in his circumstances, would probably work there the rest of his life. His face displayed a mixture of confusion and amusement, the eyes doing the former and his mouth the latter. It would be interesting to see if Dirk's or anyone's face was capable of the inverse. Yes, talking dog, repeated the old barber. He handed Dirk change for his $20 bill. The point is, since you're in such a big hurry, that it turned out that everything wasn't quite as certain as he thought it was. He emphasized the word certain with a careful wink and a curl of his thin lips. Uh-huh. Dirk nodded. He headed for the door. His hand on the latch, he said, Sammy, you're quite a character. As the bell on the barber shop door ceased ringing, Sammy took up his broom. Sweeping up, he could see Pleat Mathras and Angelica pulling into the driveway in Bach and Mercedes' property. In his imagining, they were in far too expensive a car for either of them. However, after Pleat's book came out, who knows? Maybe Pleat would not only be able to afford such a car, but actually buy something like that. Money changes people. Even a big, lumpy hippie like Pleat Mathras. Now remember, Pleat told Angelica as he turned off the engine, try not to make Hith feel uncomfortable. Don't stare at him. I know, you told me before. Angelica looked at herself in the mirror attached to the sun visor, an out-of-character action that betrayed her nervousness. But I told you, I'm used to this sort of thing. I know this family of macaque people. Yeah, Pleat nodded in acknowledgement. He didn't believe a word of it. Macaque people. He was beginning to think that Angelica was one of these girls who tell lies just for the sake of telling lies. One that had gotten away with telling lies so often that now she tells them out of habit, like an old smoker lighting up in a church. Hith here? Pleat asked Bach. The four of them, hosts and guests, stood in the yard near Pleat's old Volvo station wagon. No, he's out there somewhere, Bach gestured at the fields stretching away towards distant jungles, mountain ranges, unexplored ruins, and other unattainable features of the landscape. Pleat relaxed. He had been worried that Angelica's forward demeanor might offend the dog, and who knew but it might be dangerous if provoked. That night, however, Pleat's tensions returned when Angelica refused to have sex with him, stating vague uneasiness with the situation. What situation? Pleat demanded in a whisper. No answer. Near some of those unexplored ruins I mentioned, deep within the jungle at the foot of a fairly small mountain range, lived the macaque people that Angelica spoke of. There were about 20 individuals in the group, the result of an illegal experiment in breeding humans with apes. They were not actually half macaque, as the name would suggest. However, early reports of the project, leaked to members of Congress and thence to the media, had mentioned something about macaques, and the name had stuck. Strangely enough, the macaque people's skin was faintly green. They were hairy, but not all over. One of the most remarkable features of their physiognomy were their thumbs, which were unusually long and, for lack of a better term, prehensile. One macaque girl whom I got to know during my time among them showed me a curious trick that I still don't quite understand. She could fold or wrap her thumb through her fist and have it stick back out of the fist in such a way that it looked like she was holding a candle or something. In fact, I told her it looked like she was holding a candle, and she just giggled in a charming way. You might disagree with me, and when the photographic essay on them is published in yet another permutation of Life magazine later this year, you will get your turn. But I find the macaque females, especially those just coming into their sexual maturity, to be quite cute. The one who showed me the thumb trick was named Marissa. Her speech was, of course, limited, not having exactly the same vocal apparatus as a full-blood human, nor, and I want to be polite about this, the intelligence. I would estimate the brightest among them to be on approximately the same mental level as the average American fourth grader. Perhaps that brings visions of distressing backwardness to your mind, but don't be unduly put off. These are a gentle people who like to laugh. I find their sense of humor to be more than enough evidence of common humanity. My arrival among the macaque people was entirely accidental. Although privy to the information received by Congress, I had not heard of either the illegal experiment nor the isolated settlement where its subjects lived. I arrived there after getting lost in the unfamiliar tunnels on the way to examine Nancy Burke. The orange color of the tunnel walls was my first clue that I was in a totally new part of the tunnel system. Almost all the tunnels that I regularly use are either dark purple or Tyrannosaurus green. Another clue were the paintings that hung on the walls between the widely spaced lighting. They showed scenes of daily life in Holland in the 1600s. The paintings in the portion of the system that I frequent are of clowns riding scorpions into churches of frozen pickle juice. I had intended to arrive at a small observation room outside either Nancy's bedroom or bathroom. Believe me, spying on a young lady changing her clothes is every bit as odious for me as it must sound to you, but I felt it had to be done to answer the question of her identity. Was she the same Nancy Burke as Scarlett Gibbon's girlfriend? Was she, in fact, a talking ape? The question would have to be resolved in some other way, for I became disoriented in the orange tunnels and found myself entering a large courtyard overgrown with vines and snaking roots. The architecture put me in mind of Angkor Wat, but the dominant iconography of the relief work on its stones was not Hindu in origin, but Prakuli. The macaque people who live in a nearby settlement, established and maintained by the same scientists who created them, knew nothing of Prakuli mythology. Their occasional wanderings through the ruins had excited their curiosity, but not enough to ask the researchers about what they had seen. Who visited them every couple of months about what they had seen. They had indeed kept the existence of the ruins from the scientists. I surmise that although they were probably unable to formulate their fears exactly, they wanted no additional intrusions on their home, which the discovery of the ancient buildings would undoubtedly unleash. I think they also didn't want to be moved from the area. Marissa, who accompanied me to the ruins one day, was most interested in the story of the Prakuli gods, watching the constellations shift during the course of their great thousands-year-long party. They lived a long time, she said. Her voice was rough, but not unfeminine. She wore her hair short on the sides, but long on top. It stuck up like a boar bristle brush. Her clothing was a simple white sundress and a pair of specially designed boots. This last was to make accommodations for her oddly shaped macaque person feet. Well, if they lived at all, they did, I answered. I had been with the macaque people for a couple of days. Although I found them charming and sweet, especially the females, it was actually more of interest. It was actually more interest in the ruins that kept me there rather than return to whatever it was I was supposed to be doing. They weren't real then? Marissa asked. Something about her reminded me of one of my cousins, but I won't tell you which one in case she ever reads this book. Fat chance of that happening. Well, probably not. At least not in these godlike forms. I gestured to one of the long reliefs that lined the walkways connecting the central temple with the outlying votive stations. They might have actually been real beings at one time, but whether they were worthy of divine veneration is another matter. My companion turned her big, soft brown eyes on me and almost fearfully asked, "Was Foghorn Leghorn real?" He was real enough to me, I answered seriously. Then I saw the crooked, uncinematic smile begin to break across her monkey face and knew that I'd been had. Still, it was a good question. Chapter 7. An ominous rolling no-back from the squiddle. I finished another chapter of my novel sitting in the back of the car and decided to take a break. After staring at the back of Clarksville's seat for a while, I announced to everyone that I thought our car needed a name. No one said anything in response. Any ideas, I asked? Jerry raised his non-existent eyebrows and pretended to look around the car for persons ready to chime in. I looked to Alec and Seville. Any ideas? Anybody? We need a name for the car. Well, dissimulated Alec, glancing at Seville. How about Speedy? Seville suggested without turning his head. No, I didn't like that. While Alec continued to look unsure of what to do, Seville purposed not to say anything further. You could tell by the set of his shoulders. Why don't you name it? Jerry told me after a couple of seconds of silence. Because I don't want to be a hog, I said. I don't want to be the only creative person in the car. Jerry ducked his head slightly and leaned towards me. But you are, he whispered. Fine, I grumbled. I was about to say the first thing that came into my head, George Clooney's prosthesis, when Alec piped up. How about Gizmo? Gizmo? What's that? She's a character in all of the two-headed boxer movies except the third one. Of course. I sighed. Okay, I slapped my thighs. The Gizmo it is. The Gizmo? Jerry puzzled. Why not just Gizmo? Gizmo the car. No, it's like a ship's name. The official exploratory vessel Gizmo. Something like that. Oh, they all expostulated. If I'd known that... Now they threw in several ideas, most of them stupid. This would have continued, but everyone would stop talking as Alec hit the brakes around the next bend in the road. He was afraid of running into one or more of the fancifully dressed people milling about, crossing the road, crowding around the boiled peanut and apple cider vendors that lined the shoulders. What's going on, I wondered. They're all dressed as Star Trek characters, Alec barked, stunned at the sight. There's Captain Pike, Seville pointed. There's another Captain Pike, Alec pointed also, but in the opposite direction. What the hell is this, I demanded. They're blocking the road. Is it a parade, speculated Alex. Hey, Jerry said as he nudged me in the arm. Didn't you want some boiled peanuts and apple cider? My mouth was still hanging open in angry vexation. I looked at Jerry and weighed his words. Yeah, you're right. Okay, Alec, try to find somewhere to park. Our driver seemed happy with the idea. I even caught Seville smiling as he studied the crowd, which seemed to be getting bigger by the minute. Make sure the Gizmo is locked, I directed Alec. We'll meet back here in 20 minutes. That seemed to me like sufficient time for a break. Jerry and I went off in one direction, Alec in another. Seville followed me. It wasn't until that moment, as I headed towards a steaming cauldron of peanuts, that I realized what a nuisance having a bodyguard protecting me would be. I purposed to relieve Seville of strict adherence to his duties at the first convenient opportunity. Want some peanuts, Seville? I asked the big man. Or would you prefer pork skins? Seville's eyes flickered. He seemed to be considering. I'll have whatever you're having, thank you. I nodded. I don't eat meat, so peanuts it was. The old man stirring the cauldron seemed to be perplexed about the people in costume as perplexed about the people in costume as we. Don't know what's going on, he told me. They just showed up a few minutes ago. I looked around as I opened my first hot peanut dripping with salt water. I saw a banner being erected on the other side of the road. It read, Starfleet needs you. Music of a distinctly incidental nature, as they say at the BBC, began to warble from speakers somewhere. Fascinating as all of this was, I decided to head back to the car. I like crowds, but I am not a sociable person. I felt I had exhausted the fun potential of this event. There were still a few minutes left before Alec was due back. I opened my notebook and began to read over the chapter I just finished. It was crap. The novel was a failure, and I knew it. Knew it like you know to hold your breath when walking past a sweaty fat man. Something had to be done. I couldn't wait until I got to the perfectual for the answer. I had to do something now. I wrote a title at the top of the next page and began writing a story to go along with it. This is what I wrote. The Secret Brotherhood will forcibly disinfect George Clooney's prosthesis.